A year is not far from now. In Caracas, a city once humming with wealth and ambition, the lights are out. Not because of storms or war, but because the system itself failed. Imagine a nation that sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, richer in natural resources than Saudi Arabia, yet where families scramble for scraps of rice and children leave home to survive elsewhere. What happened here? How does a country with everything, the infrastructure, the talent, the natural wealth, arrive at a point where even basic survival is a daily gamble? Today, we are not just telling a story of economic collapse. We are tracing the hidden forces, the structural decisions, and the cascading failures that brought Venezuela to a point of no return. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened, but why it had to happen this way. And most importantly, why this pattern may repeat in places you least expect. The thesis is simple, but the implications are profound. Venezuela's collapse was not sudden. It was predictable, measurable, and avoidable, but only if structural economic realities had been respected. For decades, the country thrived on one resource, oil. It was both a blessing and a curse, a hidden trap disguised as wealth. The patterns that emerge here are not unique. They echo historical examples from every corner of the globe. From the Dutch East Indies to Latin American resource booms, economies dependent on a single commodity have often failed in the same way. Prosperity breeds vulnerability, and vulnerability magnifies every misstep. In Venezuela, this cycle did not just play out. It accelerated, it compounded, and eventually it became irreversible. Let's start with the oil. Venezuela holds more proven reserves than any other country on Earth, over 300 billion barrels. That is a literal treasure beneath the soil. Yet this resource, instead of becoming a foundation for sustainable growth, became a structural weakness. Here's the key dynamic economists call the resource curse. When a country relies almost entirely on a single export, two things happen. First, the domestic currency becomes overvalued, making local production expensive and imports cheap. Second, the economy becomes extraordinarily sensitive to external price shocks. In Venezuela, both effects played out in full. Food production declined because it was cheaper to import rice, corn, and flour than to grow it locally. Manufacturing shrank because domestic goods could not compete with foreign imports. Oil revenues flowed into consumption and political spending, not infrastructure. The economy became fragile. And when global oil prices fell first in 2014, the cracks widened. The government, lacking reserves and revenue, faced impossible choices: cut spending, restructure debt, or devalue the currency. Each option carried political and social risk, and the path chosen would shape every outcome for the decade that followed. Here's the part nobody talks about. By the time the oil crash hit, Venezuela had already undermined its own capacity to recover. The technical knowledge, the engineers, the trained workforce capable of operating and repairing the oil industry, most had already left or been dismissed. The collapse was built into the system long before prices fell. When oil revenue declined, the government faced a choice: reduce obligations or create money. It chose the latter, initiating a period of hyperinflation that would redefine daily life in Venezuela. Inflation was not a gradual problem, it was an accelerating spiral. Year by year, the value of the currency eroded, and the system of trust underpinning the economy began to crumble. In practical terms, people could not hold money without losing it almost instantly. Salaries became irrelevant, prices for basic goods doubled daily, then tripled, then multiplied by the hour. The social effects were immediate. Families could no longer plan. Shops could not restock. People stopped saving. Every transaction became an urgent, almost instinctive act of survival. Trust, the invisible scaffolding of any economy, was gone. And with it, the ability to coordinate collective action from production to distribution collapsed. If you think hyperinflation alone explains the collapse, think again. This was only one layer. What followed was a systematic failure of infrastructure, food systems, and human capital, each reinforcing the other in a downward spiral. As the currency collapsed, hunger became a political tool. Subsidized food distribution programs were meant to provide relief, but were often tied to loyalty and compliance. Access to basic nutrition became selective. At the same time, millions fled. By the mid-2020s, roughly a quarter of the population, around 7 to 8 million people, had left the country. This was not a typical migration wave. These were the doctors, engineers, teachers, and technicians, the very people necessary to maintain any functioning society. Imagine an economy losing its brainpower at a rate of 25% in a decade. Now imagine trying to restart the same economy without those people. That is the reality Venezuela faced. Physical systems failed in tandem with human capital. Power grids faltered, water treatment plants stopped operating, hospitals lost the ability to maintain essential equipment. The Guri Dam, supplying the majority of the nation's electricity, experienced outages that left cities in darkness for days. Without reliable electricity, essential services, from healthcare to food storage, were crippled. Here is the critical point. These failures were not natural disasters. They were the logical outcome of years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and systemic neglect. By now, some of you may be asking, could this have been reversed? The answer is complicated. A partial recovery was technically possible, but only if structural decisions had been made earlier. Once human capital is lost, infrastructure decays, and trust evaporates, the costs of reversal become exponentially higher. As traditional revenue streams dried up, informal and illicit economies expanded, gold mining, smuggling, and drug trafficking became a financial lifeline for certain factions within the state. This created a perverse system of incentives. Loyalty was no longer maintained through legitimacy or governance, but through access to scarce resources and illicit revenue streams. The economy transformed into what some analysts now call a zombie state, functioning in some ways, but lacking a sustainable, lawful economic foundation. Even when opportunities emerged to stabilize the economy through international agreements, gradual reforms, or currency adjustments, they were often ignored or rejected. Political calculations, personal pride, and short-term survival strategies repeatedly overrode long-term structural thinking. This is a recurring pattern in economic collapses. The system reaches a point where leadership decisions, no matter how well-intentioned, are constrained by past actions. By 2025, the options available to restore stability were fewer than ever. Here's why this matters beyond Venezuela. Resource dependence, hyperinflation, and structural decay are not unique. Other countries with concentrated wealth and fragile institutions could experience similar cascades if patterns repeat. Venezuela's story echoes history. The Dutch Republic's 17th century boom and subsequent decline after over-reliance on spice trade. Argentina in the early 2000s, which collapsed under debt mismanagement and currency overvaluation. Zimbabwe in the 2000s, destroyed by hyperinflation and currency failure. Patterns repeat. Wealth concentrated in one sector, overvalued currency, overextended government spending, and loss of trust consistently produce collapse. Venezuela is the latest and perhaps the most dramatic modern example. By the mid-2020s, Venezuela had passed a critical threshold. When an economy loses the ability to pay its workers, maintain infrastructure, feed its population, and enforce basic laws, it enters a point of no return. At this stage, every decision compounds the crisis. Every new policy is reactive rather than proactive. International aid, investment, or reforms are insufficient to undo the damage rapidly. If this is making sense so far, stay with me. The next part explains why, even after partial stabilization, the social and economic scars of a collapse linger for generations. Pause for a moment and imagine what it feels like to wake up in a city where the lights might never come back on, where hospitals struggle to run ventilators and refrigerators are empty because electricity cuts last for days. This is not fiction. It was Caracas in the 2020s. And to understand how it got here, we need to go beyond numbers and politics. We need to see how a system, once strong, can erode from within, quietly, almost invisibly. The first layer of collapse often goes unnoticed: the erosion of human decision-making capacity. Leaders, managers, engineers, and technicians, anyone capable of planning, fixing, or innovating, are either removed, dismissed, or demoralized over time. In Venezuela, this happened slowly. A factory manager might have been replaced for political loyalty. An engineer might have left because the salary didn't cover daily necessities. A teacher might have migrated for stability. Each departure seemed small. Each individually might have seemed inconsequential. But collectively, they created a brain drain so severe that entire industries could no longer function. It's easy to think that a country can just recover when prices rebound. But recovery depends on knowledge, skills, and trust. Without the people who know how to run complex systems, any sudden influx of money or resources becomes useless, or worse, mismanaged. Imagine trying to operate a refinery with no trained engineers, or a hospital with no trained staff. Money alone cannot replace human capital once it's gone. Now let's layer in another invisible but deadly factor: incentives gone wrong. In a healthy economy, incentives reward productivity, innovation, and cooperation. In Venezuela, incentives were increasingly tied to scarcity and loyalty, not to production. Subsidized goods, essential services, and even employment became tools to maintain political control rather than tools to grow the economy. This creates a subtle but critical shift. People begin to focus on survival and extraction, not creation and investment. When the system rewards short-term gain over long-term stability, collapse accelerates silently. Consider this: a family might wait hours in line for subsidized food, only to receive less than they need. A doctor might work under severe shortages, prioritizing patients based on connections rather than need. Over time, these small misalignments compound. Trust erodes and society begins to operate transaction by transaction, survival by survival. Coordination, planning, and investment, the bedrock of any functioning economy, slowly disappear. Another overlooked layer is informal and illicit economies. When official structures fail, alternative systems emerge. In Venezuela, gold mining in the south, Smuggling networks and drug trafficking filled gaps left by government failure. At first glance, these might seem like solutions, but they are double-edged swords. They provide short-term liquidity and jobs, but they deepen dependency on fragile and illegal systems, making the formal economy harder to restore. Think of it as a fire that burns slowly. The smoke may give temporary warmth, but the structure underneath is weakened, making it impossible to rebuild without collapse. And then there's psychological collapse, something that rarely appears in charts or economic models. Living under constant uncertainty, hyperinflation, and scarcity changes behavior. People start hoarding, mistrusting neighbors, avoiding long-term planning, and even changing the way they perceive money and value. A currency loses not only its economic worth, but also its social contract. This is why hyperinflation isn't just about prices. It is about the collapse of the very fabric of daily life. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at regional effects. When Venezuela's collapse intensified, it triggered ripple effects across Latin America. Migration waves created pressure on neighboring countries, disrupting labor markets and public services. Informal trade and smuggling networks expanded across borders. What starts as a national failure quickly becomes a regional destabilizer. This is why understanding Venezuela is not just about one country. It's about understanding the global nature of systemic risk. History offers other striking examples. Consider Germany in the 1920s. Hyperinflation eroded trust in savings, social cohesion broke down, and political extremism flourished. Or Argentina in the early 2000s, where currency overvaluation, debt, and mismanagement created waves of poverty, migration, and social unrest. Each case teaches the same lesson. Once a system reaches a critical point where trust, human capital, and incentives are broken, recovery is not just slow, it becomes structurally harder every day. Even technological systems aren't immune. Electricity, water, and transportation all depend on maintenance, skilled operators, and proper funding. In Venezuela, failing power grids and water treatment plants were not just technical failures, they were symptoms of systemic collapse. Every outage, every broken pipeline, every hospital without power was both a cause and a consequence of broader economic dysfunction. It's a feedback loop. Collapse breeds collapse. Now, let's talk about timescales. Many people assume a collapse happens overnight. In reality, Venezuela's collapse took decades to form, but the effects compounded exponentially once critical thresholds were crossed. The 2014 oil price drop was not the trigger, it was the accelerant. The real collapse was decades in the making: over-reliance on oil, currency mismanagement, brain drain, infrastructure neglect, and political distortion of incentives. When a crisis finally hits, it appears sudden, but it was decades in preparation. And here's a crucial insight. Rebuilding is never symmetrical. The effort required to rebuild a collapsed system is vastly higher than the effort required to maintain a functioning system. A single good policy or cash injection cannot restore trust, knowledge, or infrastructure overnight. Recovery is slow, generational, and incomplete if foundational mistakes are ignored. Even partial stabilization may mask persistent weaknesses that linger for decades. This is why the human story matters as much as the economic story. Millions of Venezuelans were displaced, families separated, education disrupted, and careers derailed. Economic models cannot fully capture the social trauma, the lost years of schooling, or the lost innovation that would have been generated by a functioning society. These are invisible costs, yet they are among the most permanent. Finally, consider the lessons for other countries. Concentrated resource dependence, short-term political incentives, and misaligned systems of trust are not unique to Venezuela. Every country with a dominant commodity, fragile institutions, or political centralization is susceptible. Patterns repeat because human behavior and institutional weaknesses repeat. By studying Venezuela, we can anticipate potential risks, understand early warning signs, and avoid repeating the same mistakes elsewhere. So when you see headlines about inflation, debt crises, or migration in other nations, remember this: the true danger is systemic, invisible, and compounding. By the time it becomes obvious to outsiders, the system may already be in irreversible decline. Venezuela teaches us that the most important signals are often hidden beneath the surface: in trust, incentives, human capital, and institutional resilience. This is why history matters, why economics matters, and why understanding systems matters. Because the next Venezuela might not be Venezuela at all. It could be a country you never expected. The question is whether we see the warning signs before it's too late. Even as some sectors stabilize with dollarization or external aid, the social consequences remain. Generations of lost education, migration of skilled labor, and widespread poverty leave enduring deficits. Rebuilding trust in institutions takes decades. Reestablishing local production requires retraining and investment. And in a globalized world, delays in rebuilding mean permanent shifts in regional influence and economic alignment. Venezuela is a cautionary tale, not about ideology, not about personalities, but about systems. Concentrated dependence on a single commodity invites disaster. Ignoring human capital erosion accelerates collapse. Trust, the invisible glue of economies, is as critical as currency or oil. Once incentive structures favor extraction over production, recovery becomes exponentially harder. If this deep dive has helped you see the hidden patterns, hit subscribe. Not for headlines, not for speculation, but for understanding the forces shaping economies before they become crises. Venezuela's economy reached a point of no return. But the exact moment when another country crosses that threshold is never obvious until after the fact. History repeats, quietly, relentlessly. The question is not if patterns will emerge again, it's when, and whether we will recognize them in time. Think about that, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because understanding the past is the only way to navigate an uncertain economic future.